Hello everyone, so welcome to Kembali 2020, a Rebuild Bali Festival, a digital program designed to inspire, excite, reconnect, and revitalize the Balinese and Indonesian community from 29th of October until the 8th of November 2020. So Kembali, the Indonesian word for return or come back, represent the revitalization in the face of global challenges. The festival will unite people in Bali and Indonesia together with an international audiences. At a time when travel is largely impossible and creating connection is more important than ever before. My name is Rivo Saulus, and today I'm going to host you on this event, the Contemporary Indonesian Fashion Through the Looking Glass. And our speaker today is a former lecturer, a model, and also the author of the book, The Contemporary Indonesian Fashion Through the Looking Glass. So without further ado, I would like you to please welcome Miss Alessandra Lopez y Royo. Alex, hello, good evening from Ubud.
Hi, good evening. It's daytime here in London.
Is they, yeah.
Yes, it's almost lunchtime. But yeah, and I am absolutely delighted to be part of this event. And of course, it's a wonderful opportunity also to be able to talk about my effort, this book, which came out last year. And it's one of the first books in the English language about Indonesian fashion today. So, I kind of ventured into a completely new area. And of course, when you do that, there's various problems, and perhaps we can talk about those as we
Nice.
go along.
Nice. And we're surely going to talk more about that later. Okay, so Miss Alex, so from a lecturer with a PhD in art history and archaeology, to all of this thing, to the fashion model, the book offer. I mean, like for me, I think it is quite a pivot, right? I mean, I can tell. So, what is your reason of doing so?
Okay, actually, it's something that I do discuss in the book because it helps to situate me. I taught art and archaeology, well, art history and visual culture, really, even though I did my PhD in art and archaeology of Indonesia. So that was, the beginning of my connection with Indonesia for many years. And then as it happened, as a visual culture expert, of course, or somebody who would discuss visual culture, I was very interested in looking at images of fashion, etc. So that was my first exposure, if you like, as an academic to fashion. And then as it happened, and this was entirely by chance, I was asked to take part in a photo shoot, which was about unconventional beauty, because I was, I'm talking about several years ago, nearly 15 or 16 years ago, when I was one of the few women that you could see around with gray hair. I kind of didn't color my hair. So that was regarded, now it's, I wouldn't say common, but it's, there's lots and lots of women who do. But back then it was quite unusual to see a woman who was not very old with gray hair. So I was asked to be part of this photo shoot. And it was for non-professional models, and it was unpaid. But, it was a nice experience. And when I was there, I actually found that I really enjoyed the whole process. And so I had a set of nice pictures, and I sent them just for fun to a couple of agencies. One of them took me. And then, I started modeling, but it was kind of secondary to my activity as a lecturer, until at some point I was forced to make a choice, because modeling has certain commitments, and of course lecturing has also certain commitments, and at some point it was difficult to reconcile the two of them. And I also wanted the opportunity to travel more and to do some writing in my own time, not being tied, to the academic calendar or whatever. So I decided to go freelance. And as it happened, then modeling became my main activity, but not my only one. I also, I also write, do research, and so on. Yeah.
Right. So as you said, like there's a possibility to travel more, right? And also you have your study it is an Asian study. So Alex, I mean, like I'm pretty sure that we would like to know, like what brought you to Indonesia at the first glance.
The first time, when I was doing my PhD. Oh, well, because I was interested in archaeology, in art, really. But, you can't separate art from archaeology when you talk about places like Indonesia or India. And I was very interested in the architecture and the sculptures of Hindu Javanese temples. And so that's why I decided to do my doctoral dissertation on that. And that was, I think it was back in 1989 that I first came to Indonesia. And, I was researching the temples, etc. And but of course, being in Indonesia meant being exposed to Indonesian culture and different facets of Indonesian culture. So I became interested in the dancing, because dance is another big passion of mine. So, and, one thing or another. So when I then became interested in fashion, became involved in fashion, and decided to write about fashion, one of the things that came to mind was, well, let's look at fashion in a non-Western context, because fashion is global. And how come that we only talk about the fashion that comes out of New York, Milan, London? And, what about the fashion of these other places where fashion is consumed very avidly and is also made? And so it came to me, oh, I could go to Indonesia, I could have a look, because I was aware of the fact that there was so much going on in Indonesia. And that's really, and I started, but before deciding to write the book, I thought, well, let me do some reading about it. And I found that there was nothing. And I thought, how come? I mean, people really are ignoring a very, very important area, and they are ignoring a very important fashion. So I thought, okay, I will write the book then.
Oh, nice. That sounds really interesting. So now, I would like you to tell us about your book, The Contemporary Indonesian Fashion Through the Looking Glass, right? So, I mean, like, I would like you to explain us about the creative processes. I mean, like, and what triggers you to make the book.
Absolutely. And I should really explain the title, because although I do talk about Indonesian fashion, I actually look at global fashion. And so I kind of see, Indonesian fashion as a kind of mirror of what is happening at the global level. That's why I talk about I use the metaphor of the looking glass. So my book is not really, it is an academic text. I mean, it's published by Bloomsbury, and it's part of the dress and fashion research series. But at the same time, I wanted my book to be very accessible, because I was fully aware that there was very, very little that had been written about Indonesian fashion, contemporary Indonesian fashion, that there are lots of misconceptions about fashion, about Indonesian fashion outside Indonesia. I mean, if you ask anybody, they will tell you, oh, yes, it's all about modest wear. But that's only a part of it. It's not the only type of fashion that comes out of Indonesia. And somehow that means pigeonholing it. And in fact, there is tremendous creativity within Indonesia and among Indonesian designers. And I wanted to highlight that. And I also wanted people to look at the whole structure of fashion, the fashion world, as it has developed in Indonesia, because it mirrors very closely the development of fashion globally. So it's a similar system with the same problems that you find elsewhere. And so it's an interesting case study. And so that's how I really came about thinking about this book and then writing it. I mean, it involved spending some time in Indonesia to look at the fashion scene, and I did that. I was very fortunate to receive a fellowship that allowed me to do so.
Ah,
And then, traveling back and forth. Of course, these days when you do research, the internet is very important. You need to know how to use it. This was something that I used to tell my students, although it's been a while since I actually taught. So they may have learned that by now. You can't trust everything that you see online, but you can use online resources very carefully, and you really have tremendous access to everything, amazing libraries, amazing material. You just have to know how to go about it. So my research was done in Indonesia, it was done online in London, it was done in libraries, and then I finally wrote the book. And I knew while I was writing the book that it was just the beginning of a conversation, that I couldn't cover everything. And, there's so much more that can be said. And that's why when people say to me, oh, you didn't talk about this, you didn't talk about that. And I think, it's only a book, not a series of books. I
right.
couldn't possibly put everything into one book, because otherwise the reading would not have been an easy one. It would have been a huge tome that nobody would approach, and that was not the point. I really want people to be able to see the book. I can't wait for it to come out in paperback, just to see the book, pick it up and read it, And yes, there is the academic discourse, it is part of the academic discourse, but I try to write as accessibly as possible so that people can sort of get a good sense of what is going on and the various issues that are connected with the fashion world in Indonesia and outside Indonesia, with the fashion world globally.
Right. So I think because you mentioned about modest wear in Indonesia, because I kind of agree, as maybe we know that Indonesia is the largest Muslim population in the world. So which means that, modest wear sells a lot here. But let us talk about another side of the fashion, like, the high fashion designer here. Like, as you said that you featured August Susastro, and actually one of my Indonesian senior model, Miss Pakita Wijaya, in your book cover. So, I mean, how is your relationship with them and the other Indonesian designer, Alex?
Okay, Matt. Okay, my relationship with all the Indonesian designers that I met is excellent. I mean, I have been welcomed. People were very happy to talk to me. And so I really treasure my memories of my fieldwork in Indonesia. With Augusto, of course, we got on extremely well. He was one of the first people I met when I first arrived in Jakarta to do this project. It was in October. It was in September 2015, and he was one of the first people I met. We had a long conversation. I went to see his atelier, and we sort of kept in touch over time. Pakita Vijaya, I don't really know, but I loved that particular picture because it is a kind of in my book I talk about mimesis and what it means. When mimesis, of course, implies also quite a number of changes, and it's kind of tongue-in-cheek, very often so. And there is a very, very well-known picture of Azadin Alaya with one of his tallest models, who's also wearing very high heels. And Azadin was actually quite small, much smaller than Augustus Susastro. And
exactly.
So there's this picture of Azadin Alaya, and the model, you see the silhouette, the back. And I can't remember who the model was. And she has her hand on his head, and you can see this discrepancy in height between the two of them. And Azadin, with his wonderful smile, he was a very usually a very kind of jovial, very solar person. So this picture kind of it doesn't copy it, but there's a reference, in a very kind of postmodern sense. There is a reference to it, and I thought anybody who's seen Azadin Alaya will be intrigued by this picture and will kind of connect the two. And I loved it, and I also love the contrast. I mean, Pekita is, of course, a mature model, and and very elegant, and she's wearing one of Augusta's creations.
Yes.
And Augusta is wearing traditional Javanese dress, but his head is not covered.
Yep.
And that is a very interesting point, because usually, the head would be covered, but it's a kind of a take on that. And I think there's so much in this image, and it's so telling. And you know what they say, an image is worth 1,000 words. Yes, I think so. People who are, anybody can pick up the book and can look at that image and think, wow, that's very interesting. And it's a kind of a way of enticing the reader to kind of peruse the book and engage with the issues that I present. That's it.
Nice. So I kind of agree though. I mean, like when you mentioned Asdin Alaya, and I had take a look to the book. I mean, oh yes, now I got the reference. But and it is pretty good. Like, like Paquita has a really statuesque figure here, and also like August is like, I just love it at the first glance.
Yes, absolutely. It's a very nice way of referencing something that is known globally, and at the same time turning it into something else, which is and something that can be contextualized as Indonesian. And I think this is what Augusta is able to do with his work. And he's very knowledgeable. He has a very deep knowledge of fashion and the arts, not just of Indonesia, but of world art, I would say. So
Exactly.
That's him. Yeah.
Nice. All right, so we're still talking about the contemporary Indonesian fashion. I mean, when I hear about the contemporary Indonesian fashion, I mean, one of the first names that pops in my mind is actually Lulu Lutfi Labibi, and he's from Yogyakarta, as he does a lot of drapery and lurik fabric, which is the traditional Japanese fabric. So, Alex, I wonder, how do we define the contemporary Indonesian fashion is? Is it from the fabrics, or maybe the creative thinking, or another aspect? Tell us your view about that.
Well, contemporary means just that, what is happening now, basically, and what is being made by creatives, creative designers in Indonesia. Now, Indonesia, it's made up of many islands, but it's not isolated. Indonesia is very much part of the world and is an interlocutor in the global discourse. So what I find that people in Indonesia are very au fait with what is happening in the rest of the world. Especially, I'm talking particularly about creative people, artists, etc. And they're able to contribute to that global conversation. It's sad, though, that elsewhere people may not know so much about the developments in Indonesia. That's the problem, and this happens also in the field of contemporary art.
Right.
I mean, only the people that manage to go to Indonesia and have first-hand exposure to what is going on, then they will be able to kind of think about Indonesian artists as contemporary. Otherwise, the image that people get, people who have not been to Indonesia, is kind of is a stereotyped image of Indonesia as producer of batik, wood carving, and everything is as it was thousands of years ago. That doesn't make any sense. It's impossible. It's never been the case. But unfortunately, I have to say that often the Indonesian diplomats abroad have tended to kind of cultivate that image of a timeless Indonesia without really paying attention to what is actually happening now, except perhaps in the case of modest wear, because that is very important from an economic point of view. And certainly there has been a push to making modest wear as representative of Indonesian fashion, which I mean, it is and it isn't. I think it would be quite unfair to sort of say that everybody in Indonesia has embraced, all women in Indonesia have embraced modest wear. Not all of them have. In fact, Indonesian fashion is amazingly diverse, and it is this diversity that needs to be taken into account. Going back to what you were saying about Lutfi, I actually met him, and I love his work because he is able to cross the bridge between fashion and art. And his fashion shows are actually contemporary art installations, and I absolutely love the way he approaches his work.
Yes, exactly. I mean, like when I had an opportunity to visit Lulu Lutfi Labibi's place in Yogyakarta, and I can tell that I kind of love how the craftsmanship that he create from the lurik fabric into like all those draperies. I mean, like for me, it's actually amazing, and how he created his fashion presentation. I mean, like in the form of fashion show, and do a little bit theatrical. I mean, like for me, that's what I say that it's a contemporary fashion. So I mean, it's amazing.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, it's a trend, of course, that at the moment now with COVID and in post-COVID-19 times, everything has changed. Fashion shows have become very rare, and I don't know what's going to happen really. So perhaps somebody should write a book about what's happening to contemporary fashion in Indonesia post-COVID-19, or contemporary fashion globally in post-COVID-19 times, because everything has changed so dramatically over the past few months. But, having said that, the theatricality of the fashion show, that is something that I think in Indonesia people have understood extremely well, and have been able to do extremely well. And it's something that is comparable. And here I would like to insert some Western examples. I mean, going back in time to Alexander McQueen, who was one of the pioneers of the fashion show as performance. And even more recently, even though it was in post-COVID-19 times, Maria Grazia Curie, who now leads Dior, she had an amazing fashion show in Lecce, which is a city in the south of Italy, to which she has a strong connection because her father and grandfather are from that area. And the fashion show was amazing because she merged the local traditions of dancing with the clothes, and it was done in a fantastic setting, that of the Duomo or cathedral. So it was pretty amazing. So it was again that idea of the fashion show as performance.
Right. So, and you mentioned Alexander McQueen. I mean, like as all we know that he's a genius, and that makes me remember his is either autumn, winter, or spring, summer, where he has the fashion presentation with a contemporary dancer. Yes, and that one, and that actually reminds me of in Jakarta Fashion Week, there is a one designer who does the fashion show in a dance. Bin house. Maybe you have heard about that. I mean, like different concept, but all the models are like just like selling fabrics with while dancing, which it's pretty amazing. I mean, like how the form of theater into, and we merge that into a form of fashion presentation.
Oh, but absolutely. I think that that goes very well actually within the Indonesian milieu and sort of the way Indonesians feel about events. I mean, there's always some singing, some dancing. That's part of Indonesian culture. So I have seen the shows by Bin House. I've also seen shows that use more traditional dancing or comedians like Anne Avanti, for example, and poetry readings, and then installations, lots of installations. I mean, I must say that when I was in Indonesia doing my research, I had a great time because I was going from one event to the other and really enjoying myself. Enjoying myself, admiring, the creativity of these amazing designers, admiring the way they would present their work. And they didn't have to be hugely expensive fashion shows, but it was just the way they would think about the whole thing. Yeah, it was great. Yes.
All right. So now we're going to talk about the Indonesian designer in global stage. For example, Texavarius dress that is worn by Lady Gaga, and also Rinaldi Unardi's hat piece worn by Madonna for, if I'm not mistaken, for 3 times. So do you what can we do in aiming to become more visible international stage as an Indonesian designer?
What can I say? That's always the question. It's a question of infrastructure. It's a question of support, the kind of support that Indonesian designers receive or do not receive. That's a big question. That is because yes, individual designers might be able to sort of achieve a certain visibility, but overall, like I said, and it's still the case, Indonesian fashion is not even regarded as fashion. I mean, I really have to be as blunt as that, in the sense that people just don't know anything about it, and they think, oh, what do you mean? You mean batik? No, because that's the other thing, textiles. Everybody talks about textiles, and people think that, in Indonesia, people just wear sarong, and they do, but not just. So yeah, I think that the problem, I mean, it's a very important issue. It's something that needs to be resolved. It's to do with infrastructure. It is to do with the kind of support that is given or can be given to the designers in order to be able to achieve that visibility globally. I don't know whether this answers your question, but I don't have a solution, I'm afraid. I'm just,
no worries.
My thing. Oh yes, I wanted to say another thing, because you mentioned quite a few designers, and of course that's one of the things that people always say to me. Oh, you didn't talk about this. You didn't talk about that designer. This is not an encyclopedia. I had to be, in my choice of designers, I was quite conservative, you can say, in the sense that I went for names that are quite well known. At the same time, I tried to present, people that started working, say, in the 70s or in the 80s, and people that are working today, starting more recently, like, for example, Augusto Sasastro. I didn't include lots of, avant-garde. I mean, I talked about Lulu. I didn't include a lot of the so-called avant-garde designers. I know that some people are very, very upset about this, but it's not an encyclopedia of Indonesian designers. It wasn't meant to be. It was just, my ideal reader is somebody who doesn't know very much about contemporary Indonesian fashion, picks up the book and gets a sense of what is going on. So in terms of design, in terms of how fashion is consumed, in terms of the issues that are present within the fashion industry, and also the allied industries like the beauty industry. Just a kind of, if you like, an overview. And in doing so, of course, when you try to do an overview, then obviously you need to leave out quite a few things, and you end up perhaps not talking about things in depth. And I guess that, this is one of, I'm the first one to acknowledge that. But then I always said from the very beginning, this is the start of a conversation. Let's start talking about Indonesian fashion. Let's start talking about fashion from non-Western, from the non-Western world. So, for example, there's fashion from Vietnam, or even fashion from China. Let's have a conversation about fashion that really is totally inclusive.
Inclusivity. Nice. All right. So you have mentioned Anna Avanti. I mean, like she's doing amazing in her fabrics and everything. And also, Anna Avanti is pretty much well known by using like a non-model people to model her collection. And also, I can relate this in your book because at one chapter you say like they're a blogger, influencer, and you stated that personal style blogging may have reached a dead end, and brands nowadays are collaborating with influencer to advertise their product, right? So, do you think this would last, or there is a possible new form that would replace the fashion influencer in the near future?
Oh, absolutely, because everything is changing so fast and so quickly.
I
I mean,
know.
blogging is a thing of the past. I mean, I do blog because I enjoy blogging. I don't even write about fashion anymore. I just have a blog in which I talk about anything that I want to talk about. And so it might be fashion, it might be art. I just enjoy blogging. But blogging is very much a thing of the past. It was superseded by Instagram. But even Instagram is now kind of losing ground because of so many problems and the fake followers and so on and so forth. People, what was true, I mean, and again, going back to my book, what was true back in 2015, I did my research between 2015 and 2018, and now in 2020, everything is different because we've had this massive thing, the pandemic, which has really changed our lives. People can't travel anymore. I mean, I'm a keen traveler. I was supposed to go just for a weekend to Venice the first week of November. I had to cancel that because now it's so difficult to travel because you have to quarantine. So what was the point of going there for a weekend and then being stuck in a hotel? So I had to cancel it, and so on and so forth. I mean, brands, for example, could not participate in London Fashion Week because they were not able to travel. And I'm talking about those brands that are represented perhaps not by the mainstream London Fashion Week, but by other organizations which are quite well established, but they couldn't come over. So, and things are developing online. So the whole thing of influencers, I guess everybody is becoming an influencer these days. So that will certainly change, into what? I don't know. That's the beauty of it.
It is like everything. I can tell that everything nowadays are pretty uncertain because back at the time I started a fashion blog as well, and from 2010 to 2014 it was pretty good. I mean, like I had a pretty loyal readers, and after I read your book, I mean, like, okay, I kind of agree that because many of the people are starting to do the Instagram, and yes, some of them, not all, are buying the followers and stuff like that. But it's I'm quite amazed how fashion is changing, and
it is changing. Instagram, actually, people are now getting bored of Instagram. I mean, you go to Instagram and you think, oh my God, it's always the same. It's always the same.
yeah,
So people need something different. Yeah,
it is. I mean, like, so I kind of miss like the old fashioned wigs. But anyway, Alex, you went to Jakarta Fashion Week, also Indonesia Fashion Week, right? Those two major events that held in Indonesia, right? So, based on your observation, do you think there is a possibility of making Jakarta Fashion Week or Indonesia Fashion Week to be the epicenter of fashion events, maybe let's say in the scale of Southeast Asia? What do you think about that?
To be honest, I don't
Mm-hmm.
know. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
a few months ago, I would have said yes, but because now the Fashion Week is actually being questioned,
Yep,
and because the Fashion Week is so difficult to put together because,
it
the
really is.
pandemic is still there.
Yep.
So maybe we really need to think about something else. Maybe we will
Mm-hmm.
have a development of digital presentations,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
so there will not be we can, when that happens, we can no longer talk about an epicenter because,
Yep.
as you know, when something is online, it can be accessed
Mm-hmm.
simultaneously from any part of the world. So I don't really know. Certainly the push towards having a kind of national fashion week
Mm-hmm.
has always been very strong in Indonesia. It was
Yep.
there. And basically, okay, Jakarta Fashion Week and Indonesian Fashion Week were kind of two very important reference points. But they were not the only ones. And there's always been other fashion weeks going
Yep.
on. So, but we will have to see what is going, I mean, how things are going to develop in the next few months. And then we
Mm-hmm.
will be able to begin to answer that question, because at the moment it's a big question mark, not just in Indonesia, but everywhere.
It is. But you have mentioned about the digital fashion presentation, and couple of weeks ago there is a pretty famous designer, and his name is Sabto Joyo Kartiko, if you heard about him. And
Yeah.
he does, yeah, and he does digital fashion presentation filmed in Yogyakarta. And the collection is as after I have watched the fashion presentation, I can tell that the collection is is inspired by a rooster. Can you imagine that?
Wow.
Like I was like it's it's pretty amazing how these times people can be really creative. I mean, like, as we and a couple of days back ago, I watched Michael Kors Spring Summer 2021, and he's doing like a very chic collection, and people are singing live there. I mean, like, it's amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. But when you have digital
Mm-hmm.
presentations, however, you can't have the kind of catwalk style
Yep.
presentation, because otherwise it becomes very boring to watch.
Yep.
So that means that you can develop fashion films.
Yep.
And that means that you need to prepare those fashion films perhaps in advance of the presentation of a collection. And also that opens up an entirely new area, because then you are not just tied down to using, fashion models. You can actually create something quite different. And I think that we are seeing things like that happening. And if that is going to be the way of presenting fashion, we will see a lot more of it. Yeah, that's why everything is quite fluid at the moment, in a flux. But I'm sure that it is reconfiguring itself. And it will be, in ways that will pleasantly surprise us.
Absolutely. Great. So, Alex, I would like to talk about something in your book again. So,
Sure.
so in your book, you are also talking about fashion as an arena for activism. So, reading at those sentences, it makes me remember. Do you remember that the 2003 Christian Dior show, when an
Yes.
anti-fair activist sabotaged the show? I mean, like, I can tell that we at these times, I mean, like, we no longer see that. And these decades, I mean, like, we're talking more about racial diversity, inclusivity, like plus size models, mature models. I mean, where do you think we're going after all of these issues?
Well, I think that the fashion world
Mm-hmm.
has been kind of shaken up by various events,
Yep.
and also the fact that people are demanding greater representation, because fashion is for
Right.
everyone. So fashion activism, it's now, of course, also enmeshed with the whole issue of sustainability, which is very important. So representation and sustainability, to some extent, go hand in hand. But let me retrace my steps. Fashion activism, that's what I do. When through my modeling, I actually do some fashion activism.
Yeah.
Why? Because here I am. I'm a woman of a certain age with particular look, and I am basically saying I'm there to represent the kind of women that you wouldn't necessarily have seen in fashion until a few years ago, but now
Hmm.
it started happening. And I think that it's important that fashion is more inclusive in terms of representation. So, for example, I'd like to see models, because after all, models do represent
Yep.
that. I'd like to see disabled models, because it's
Ah,
like saying that, you disabled people, they have nothing to do with fashion. Who says so? I mean, and also anyone can become disabled at any point in their lives, a bad
right.
fall, and suddenly you find yourself in a wheelchair. I mean, touch wood. But it can happen.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
all
yeah.
I'm saying is that who is disabled and who is
Hmm.
able-bodied. There can be a very sort of fine boundary between the two, and so I'd like to see that. I'd like to see greater representation of people, because fashion is for
Yeah,
everybody, and because we all buy fashion, we all wear clothes,
exactly.
and fashion is a way of fashion goes together with style, and it's a way of being creative about the clothes that you wear. Yeah.
Yeah, great. So, yeah, I mean, like, as because you're talking about like the representation. I mean, it makes me remember like maybe the early 2010 or 2012, the 90s model, Kristen McManamy.
Oh
Kristen McManamy.
yes.
Yes, Kristen McManamy. And after all of these times, she came back with a long gray hair, and
Oh yes.
she booked Roberto Cavalli Spring Summer 2011 or 2012. I kind of forgot that, along with Naomi Campbell. I mean, like it for me, it's really interesting. I mean, how these decades gives opportunity to like wider audience. You know?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that was the beginning, and of the acceptance of
Mhm.
white hair, and yeah, I've always I love, of course, I do like Kristen. She's one of my favorite models, and certainly I thought, wow, long white hair. Maybe I
Yeah,
can
yeah.
grow mine.
You already have your long.
Yeah, I kind of, but back then my hair was not that long, and so I decided to
Right.
really grow it very long. Yes.
I mean, like you are. I mean, like even yourself, you are signed as a model. I mean, it's a great models
Model
agency.
agency,
Yeah, yeah,
yes.
yeah. It's like the agency is dedicated to the aging men and women, right?
Yes, it's an
Hmm.
agency that kind of, I mean, even the term grey is kind of tongue in cheek, because not everybody who is signed by grey has grey hair. But it's kind of, attempting to redress the balance and saying that, here are some wonderful people who are also very skilled. I mean, Grey is not just a model agency, it's also a talent agency.
Yeah.
For example, they look after my engagements as a speaker and so on. So these are some wonderful people with lots of
Yeah.
skills that they've acquired through the work throughout their life, who can be involved in fashion, can be involved in advertising as
Hmm.
models, because there is an aging population,
Yeah.
and so we're talking about representing that aging population in ways that are not stereotypical, not the usual old grandmother or grandfather. Yes, I mean, I am myself a grandmother, but I don't think that defines me fully.
Right.
I'm not just a grandmother. I'm very proud to be a grandmother. I adore my granddaughter. She's 10 months old. But,
Oh.
being a grandmother goes along with my being a writer, a model, a former academic, and you name it. It's part of me, but it's not just the essence of me.
Hmm.
Yeah.
All right. Looking nice as a connection. So, yeah, yeah. It's pretty good. But one thing, I mean, like you do writing, you model. I mean, like how do you manage your time and still looking good? That's the thing I
Thank
really
you.
wonder.
That's a
So,
great compliment. Thank you.
and I mean, like, would you mind to tell us a bit about your daily routine? I mean, like your beauty secret. I'm pretty sure listener would like to
I
know.
don't know whether I have any. I mean, basically, I'm a very active person, and
Mm-hmm.
dance is a great passion of mine. And whenever I have time, you will find me in a ballet class. And these
Ah.
days, that it's possible to do ballet at home through online connection. I always do it
Mm-hmm.
at home. I actually have a bar in this very room. I'm not
Uh-huh.
going to bring it. I'm not going to drag it, but I have a ballet bar. And I do ballet. I do a ballet class every day. I also do, now that it's possible to go back to studios, I also go, to a dance studio, and I also have my ballet class there.
Mm-hmm.
Even when I was in Jakarta, to kind of, sometimes I wanted to get away from fashion,
Yeah,
and I
yeah.
used to go to a dance center to do ballet classes, and I was surprised that I wasn't the only grown up. I mean, there were lots of little girls, but I wasn't the
Oh,
only grown up that would go to ballet classes, and they
oh,
were
really?
amazing. I mean, they I lived in Kemang,
Ah,
and I used
great.
to go to the Kemang Dance Center, and the teachers were amazing. I really enjoyed doing ballet with them, even though they used to do repertoire, and so that was when I had to stop when they were doing repertoire for the senior girls, because there was no way I could do bits of Giselle or whatever. But it was great to be able to be in a ballet class, and
Right.
so I guess that my involvement with dance and ballet in particular
Yeah.
is something that helps me to keep in good shape. And then I guess my diet, in the sense that I eat everything. I absolutely eat everything,
Oh, you
but in
do?
small portions. Having said that, I don't eat red meat. I don't really like red meat, but
Mm-hmm.
I do eat. I have chocolate if I want to, but in small portions. I mean, I try to kind of not leave the table feeling really overfull, but
Yep.
just enough. That's it, and
Great.
that's it. And in my everyday life, I wear very little makeup, very very little.
Oh.
I do wear makeup, of course, when I work,
Mhm.
when I model, but otherwise I try not to, because I think it's important that your skin should breathe. So I will not wear foundation
Mhm.
every day or anything like
Mhm.
that. So these are my beauty secrets. They are open secrets, because
They're
everybody
open
is
secret.
aware of this. Everybody is aware of this. That's all you need to do, really. And I guess it's also attitude. I mean, in my heart, I'm still, a very young woman. I feel young, and I think that that's important, the way you feel, because
Right.
that's people pick up your vibes.
Exactly.
And if you feel, enthusiastic, full of life, full of curiosity,
Yeah.
if you feel young at heart, then people will perceive you as that. And if you feel old, if you feel that your life has come to an end, that's the vibe that
Mm-hmm.
you will kind of pass on to others, and it's not a nice vibe. So I think that's very important.
Nice, nice. So, and while we're here, Alex, I mean, I would like to ask you a question that is, I want to think that I'm a fashion correspondent. So, how do you? So here, the question is, how do you define your own style?
Okay, I do think style is a very personal thing, and that's
Mhm.
one thing actually that I noticed in Indonesia. It's
Right.
sort of developing, but not quite, not fully. But style is a very personal thing, and sort of to be confident with your choices,
Mhm.
you need to be able to take stock of who you are, look at yourself in the mirror and see, and then decide what really suits you, what doesn't suit you, but not because somebody says so, but because it's the way you feel about it. And if you like particular colors, wear them. Why not? I mean, there's no rule that says that you can't wear pink if you are over 60. Wear it. Just don't wrap yourself all in pink, like a little girl, but you can wear pink in some way. I mean, I don't think, I think it's very much something that you arrive at, and it's based on personal choices. And of course, you look around, you see what is available, what, you may be inspired by other people, but I think you should try not to copy other people, not exactly in every detail, because then you will not have your own style. Yeah.
Great. So I mean, like I think that I can relate. I mean, to your job as a model as well. I mean, like you also embrace people. You also help people to. I can tell that to become more confident. Because they see themselves in let's say it's an advertisement.
Yes,
Yes.
absolutely. I think that there is that side, and that's very important. Otherwise, I would have stopped modeling if there hadn't been that as a push. But having said that, I also enjoy modeling because it's a kind of performance, and
Right.
there is a performer in me, and I really have. When I model, I have the opportunity to transform myself into a character, and I really enjoy that. I don't necessarily like all the pictures that are taken of me. There are some pictures that I acknowledge are very good pictures from a photographic point of view. I don't like myself in them, but when I look at the picture, I have been able to detach myself from it. I don't think of it as a picture of me. I just look at the picture. I think it's very important, because otherwise, you would always ask people, oh, please don't use that photo, please don't use that. And you can't do that. So, just look at it as a picture. It's a moment,
Right.
and, it's okay. And it's fun.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, okay, so I think we still have a couple of questions to go, and while we're still talking about the modeling, so I would like to relate to the Indonesian market. So, Alex, I mean, like, where is that? Let me have my question. So I mean, like, there are a couple of Indonesian models who graced the campaign and the runway. I mean, like, how do you think, what can Indonesian models do in order to reach that level? I mean, as we know that Lara Sekar, who was YSL, she was an exclusive for YSL, and also a Balinese, Devita Ravani, and she worked for Dolce and Gabbana. I mean, like, do you think there is a possibility for Indonesian model to become more visible in international fashion?
Yes, there is. Why not? There is, although there is a tendency also to regard perhaps non-Caucasian models as exotic. So there is that element of exoticism that they will need to counter or redefine. But I think that there is the opportunity. Why not? It's just that the modeling industry is also not an easy one, and you also need to be aware of the fact that not all agencies are good, and not everybody is out there to look after you. So you need to be smart. You need to be business savvy, and be aware of possible exploitation. But in general, yes, there is. There should be opportunities. I mean, after all, we do have quite a lot of internationally. We have quite a lot of Chinese models, and we have seen also the rise of the Indian models. So why not? Certainly, there is room for Indonesian models. But again, overall, I think that the whole fashion industry, and therefore also the modeling industry within Indonesia, tends to be rather inward looking, in the sense that it addresses itself to an Indonesian market rather than outside Indonesia. So, you know, there's lots of reasons why this happens, but certainly that's something that needs to be borne in mind. Yeah.
Nice. All right. So, um, while we're here at the end, maybe I would like, I mean, like, do you have any advices to maybe anything you would like to say to like fashion practitioner in Indonesia on how, any advices for them?
Fashion practitioners, I mean, for design,
Designers, yeah.
For designers, I don't know, because I'm not a designer myself, but I think that you should really, I mean, within Indonesia, you should really try and fight to get better infrastructure so that you can get greater visibility. How that can be done, I don't know. Of course, it's also a political issue, but, you know, it's a very important one. For people who want to model, I have done some modeling in Indonesia, but let me say one thing. I have never worked as a professional model in Indonesia because whatever modeling I did, it was simply for fun or just to try it, but I was never paid and I was never part of a system. I was not allowed to work in Indonesia. I was in Indonesia as a researcher and I was tied to my visa. So I want to make it very clear that I never worked as a model in Indonesia. I have worked, of course, as a model outside Indonesia and mainly through the representation of Grey before I was in another agency. So Grey, that has also taken me overseas, but you know, they were actually getting the contracts for me. So I don't really know what it is like to work as a model in Indonesia, but from what I saw and what people told me, I gathered that there are certain problems that perhaps are common to the modeling world. And I would say to girls, because it's usually girls, and boys, young girls that would like to try modeling, to be very careful, to look at the small print, to be well aware of the fact that not everybody, although they may say so, is going to look after you. And, you know, just use your common sense and, you know, do not agree to everything because it's your image and it is work. It is work. It's not something that you do just for fun, because a lot of people tend to think, oh, it's just a fun thing, so you don't need any money. No, you do, because you have bills to pay. It's something that you approach with professionalism. So develop your professionalism and expect professionalism from the people that hire you. That's my word of advice.
100%. All right. So, Alex, one more. So, any plan in what is your plan in the near future? A little bit here.
Oh God, I don't know, because like I said, you know, the pandemic has arrived and has changed everybody's plans. But I don't plan another book on Indonesian fashion. I think that now, you know, I've started a conversation and I would like to see other people stepping in and redressing the balance. If I said something that is incorrect, I'd like people to come in and sort of say so. And, you know, I would like a dialogue, conversation. So I think I've done whatever I could. But of course, my involvement with fashion continues. And now I'm looking at the possibility of doing some work. You know, maybe in southern Italy, so kind of closer home, if you like. But again, you know, COVID-19 has put a spanner in the work, and so at the moment, I'm really stuck in London. I don't know what you know, what's going to happen. So let's hope that things get better. Yeah.
Nice. All right. So yes, Alex. I mean, like we're here so thankful to have you in Kembali 2020. I mean, you know, absolutely, we're wishing you all the best on your future endeavors. So
Thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of it. I
Yeah.
love the festival. It's a great honor for me to be part of this huge festival with so many wonderful people and wonderful authors. Thank you very much. Thank
Yes,
you very much.
and make
Yeah.
sure in by any time the border is open. I mean, like, please visit us in Bali.
Absolutely, yes. I love Bali, and I'd love to come back. Yeah.
Nice. All right,
Thank
so
you.
our pleasure. So, all right, so that was our conversation. Just my conversation with Miss Alessandra Lopez y Royo, or we can tell Alex Bruni, in Contemporary Indonesian Fashion Through the Looking Glass. So, Kembali 20 was made possible with the support of Yayasan Mudraswari Saraswati Pattern Program and their donors. The Pattern Program was created to seek assistance for the survival of both festivals and the foundation. By making a valuable contribution to Yayasan Pattern Program, you will be directly involved in delivering both festivals in due time. Your contribution will guarantee the future of Indonesia's most meaningful cross-cultural platform of words, ideas, cultural, and the creative arts. Follow Ubud Writers Festival on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, or visit ubudwritersfestivals.com for more information about the Pattern Program. My name is Rico Saulus and Alexandra Lopez y Royo signing off. Thank you so much for
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you guys.